President Trump is meeting with New York Governor Andrew Cuomo this afternoon to talk about the new federal ban on New Yorkers from enrolling in expedited traveler programs like Global Entry. Well, here's what the governor had to say ahead of that meeting.
It's not about safety. If the White House, if the Department of Homeland Security thinks they need access to our database to run this trusted traveler program, I told them they can have it. I have no problem. But that's not what it's about, Willie. It's about retaliation. It's about their political opinion. It's about punishing states that don't agree with them.
NBC's Kelly O'Donnell is at the White House. Kelly, we just heard from the governor there. What is the administration's position here? We got a tweet from the president this afternoon, rolling out the carpet here for the governor, I guess you could say.
Well, of course, he is a former New Yorker. Now, Florida is his official home. So he knows Andrew Cuomo and knows a lot of the circumstances here. But this is not the kind of meeting that we often find at the White House where the cameras are brought in, where the president makes remarks. Now, he could certainly change his mind and do that. And we would certainly welcome that, wanting more access, not less, to what's happening inside. But this is a meeting on the president's schedule without it having any public component, no media coverage, that kind of thing. So it will be a question as to what we learn about what takes place inside the meeting. Often when the president has these sorts of sessions and they're not a part of his public schedule, we get a very limited readout of a description of the meeting. Certainly the administration believes that in order to properly vet those applicants who live in the state of New York for a program like Global Entry, where they get preferred status as travelers in the immigration process, that the administration claims they need access to the information that has been blocked by the state of New York. Now, the larger context of this, of course, is also the president's hard line on immigration, his opposition to things like sanctuary cities and sanctuary states. And this has ratcheted up the pressure on New York by affecting those people who travel extensively, who are doing that for business or doing that for pleasure, who may have more resources and influence to try to bring their concerns to the state government, meaning the governor of New York, to try to put pressure for a change on this. So this is a hardball for sure, with the administration going after the state of New York on this, and Governor Cuomo wanting to try to work something out. So he has commented publicly in advance of the meeting. We don't know exactly what the president's view on this will be after the meeting. The president took a shot at the governor's brother, making a comment about him on Twitter. Of course, he's an anchor at CNN. So the president sort of foaming the pathway for Governor Cuomo before this meeting today.
Kelly, the president also reacting to some remarks by his former chief of staff, John Kelly, who did a big event in New Jersey last night. John Kelly, in those comments, rebuking or criticizing his boss for abruptly removing Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman last week, of course, a key witness in the impeachment inquiry. According to the Atlantic magazine, Kelly is defending Vindman, saying, quote, he did exactly what we teach him to do from cradle to grave. He went and told his boss what he just heard. I should say this is just the latest in a string of criticisms we have heard from John Kelly of the president. How's the White House responding to this, the remarks that John Kelly made?
Well, certainly Kelly, who was speaking at an event that was intended to be off the record, although I'm sure he knows with the degree of his profile that making these kinds of comments would be newsworthy, and standing up as a former Marine general, 4-star, for an Army officer who is currently active duty in the case of Alexander Vindman, and his brother, who was also removed from his position at the NSC, the National Security Council, and they're both back, returned to the Army. The White House, through the press secretary, called this disappointing, and saying that John Kelly had been supportive of the president during his time here, and they were disappointed by these comments. And the president talking about firing John Kelly, and saying that at the time, even referring to Kelly's wife, saying that she had said that General Kelly was so fond of the president, would only say good things about him after they left their time in government service. So again, the president very prickly about this kind of criticism, as John Kelly stood up for the man in uniform who, according to Kelly, was following the law and following the chain of command as he understood it, exactly what Kelly says an Army officer should do, and should not have been punished by removing him from a prestigious post here at the National Security Council. So more back and forth with the president, as we've seen him so often lashing out at any critics.
Kelly, as you well know, the president has been watching the Democratic contest with some fascination. Certainly, we saw him on the night of the New Hampshire primary, weighing in as the candidates made their speeches. Now there's been this war of words with the Democratic presidential candidate Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York City. That's seeming to intensify a little bit today as he talked about the mayor's height, his ability to debate with his Democratic rivals. Mike Bloomberg, in turn, fighting back, shooting back at Trump, tweeting this. We know many of the same people in New York. Behind your back, they laugh at you and call you a carnival barking clown. Kelly, why is he the subject of the president's eye right now? Why is he so fixated on Michael Bloomberg?
Well, certainly the president likes to look at his field of rivals on the Democratic side. And clearly, Bloomberg has a lot of money behind him in terms of the media buying that he has been doing and is capable of doing with his substantial war trust. They have a long history together of knowing each other over the years in New York. And certainly the president is also seeing the change in the Democratic field now that there are two contests in. The president also saying today in a separate interview that he thinks, in his words, Biden is shot, meaning run out of gas, in the sense of having a tough start to begin with. Also criticizing Bloomberg, claiming that he does not believe, the president does not believe the black community would support Michael Bloomberg because of the policy in New York as mayor of stop and frisk. And the president criticizing him for apologizing for it later and saying that it was too violent and too much. The president then claiming he's doing more for the African-American community through his economic policies. So the president not leaving any rival unmarred by his aggressive approach, and certainly Michael Bloomberg giving it back with tweets in response. We don't always see that from other rivals. Some try to kind of move on and not engage tweet for tweet. At least today, Bloomberg was in that arena with him.
Kelly Donnell, always good to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.